This week, we welcome Andy Ellis, operating partner at YL Ventures, to discuss his new book, 1% Leadership. In the Leadership and Communication section, Clorox scapegoat cyber chief rewards board after crisis. The SEC to CISOs, welcome to the big leagues. SolarWinds, SEC lacks competence to regulate cybersecurity, and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Broadcasting live, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. $270. That's the average number of times a company comes under cyber attack each year. And the average cost of a successful data breach is $4.35 million. Cygnus ensures your internal and external teams are securely connected, confident, in control, and compliant during a cyber crisis. Visit securityweekly.com/Cygnus to learn more. That's CYGNVS. If your organization is ready to embrace edge computing, we have good news. The 2023 AT&T Cybersecurity Insights Report provides everything you need to know to get started. In the report, we identify the common characteristics of edge computing. We found edge use cases are rapidly coming online, and we reveal how to secure edge computing. Most importantly, you'll learn how to prepare for your edge ecosystem. Get your complimentary copy of the report today by visiting securityweekly.com/ATT Cybersecurity. That's securityweekly.com/ATT Cybersecurity. Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 329, recorded November 27th, 2023. I hope everyone had a wonderful Thanksgiving Day. I am your host, Matt Alderman. It's been a couple weeks, so we're going to get the crew back together and have a fun conversation. First, joining me remotely, my first co-host, Mr. Jason Albuquerque. Dude, we've missed a lot of football.
A lot of football to cover, but you know the story's the same with my Patriots. We had another loss this weekend. You know we're worse than the AFC, third worst in the league. So sad tales to tell. But the Broncos won. The Eagles are scary at 10-1. Ravens are next 9-3, and then we have like 6 teams at 8-3. Chiefs, Dolphins, Cowboys, Niners. It's going to be a good NFL season. Unfortunately, not for my Patriots.
Well, that means first round draft pick, though, probably.
Yeah, right. Well, you know Belichick, though. He trades him out.
Yeah. Also joining me for this episode, Mr. Ben Carr. Hey, Ben. I didn't hear a word you just said, buddy. I don't know. It's audio. Don't know what's going on. All right, let's get into it. We're always looking for great guests for all of our Security Weekly shows. Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. Andy Ellis is a seasoned technology and business executive with deep expertise in security, managing risk, and leading an inclusive culture. He is the author of 1% Leadership, operating partner at YL Ventures, and advisory CISO at Orca Security. He was the first CSO at Akamai, where he led the information security organization for over 20 years. Andy was inducted into the CSO Hall of Fame in 2021. Andy, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Thanks for having me, Matt. Great to see you. Great to see Jason. We can commiserate on how awful the Patriots are this year. And Ben, I'd love to hear you, but I also didn't catch a word.
Yes. Interesting. Yeah. We've been having some technical issues with the show already today. So, Andy, we're going to talk about your new book, 1% Leadership. And I always it always intrigues me from the author's perspective. Like, okay, why'd you write a book, and what kind of why on leadership?
So I think I might have to channel my mother-in-law, who's a professor, who said, the only reason to get a PhD is because you can't come up with a reason not to. And that's sort of how I approached writing the book. I used to read a lot of leadership books, go to a lot of leadership training. And one of the things that always struck me was how bad it all was. You'd open up this book and they would say, here's this one secret trick that if you just did this, you would be a perfect leader. Like Jack Welch did stack ranking, and that's why GE was fantastic. And you're sort of pondering, and you're like, this doesn't really feel like it's the right thing for me. And at the same time, they take that and they hide that in 300 pages. It's very hard to figure out what the actual point of the book is. I think that's Jeffrey Moore's secret. You get to the end of the book and you have to tell people it was amazing, but you're not quite sure what the message was. And as my team went through various management and leadership trainings, I found myself writing them essays that said, here's what the real takeaway is of this training. Here's the little piece you can walk away with. It's not going to be transformative, but it will make you a better leader. And at some point, I realized that those essays themselves were my leadership style and were the skill set that I tried to bring to the table and that I wanted to share with more people rather than waiting until they were, vice presidents and hardened in their ways and then go get leadership training, give you access to training earlier on in your career.
Well, that's because we cover a lot of leadership articles on this show. The second segment of this show is leadership and communication. And we know, I kind of get what you're talking about, because the thing we have to do in each of those articles is kind of like try to figure out what the nugget in that article is that we want to get across to the audience. And it sounds like that's kind of the approach for the book is, what are those learning nuggets? Extract those out in a way that's easily consumable.
Exactly. And rather than saying this one nugget is going to be the thing that makes you a great leader, say this is just a nugget. It's a skill. It's like being a quarterback. We can pick on the football theme a little more. Jalen Hurts and Mac Jones are not the same player. I think we've all seen that watching them play this season, but they play in such different ways, but they're fundamental skills that we expect out of a decent quarterback, like good decision making, the ability to scramble. There's all these skills that will come together in different ways to be a leader. So you don't want to take any one leader and say, focus on this skill, it's the one way. You want to say, like, develop your whole repertoire so that, maybe your team's 9-1 and not 2-8. Or,
Yeah.
sorry, 2-9.
And Andy, one of the things I love about the book is you call it out right in the beginning. We're so often looking for perfection and judging others, expecting them to be perfect, where you want to know what? Be a little introspective. Leadership begins with you, right? Understand that you're on this road or journey to continuous improvement. And you say it so eloquently. Be the light to yourself and then those around you, right? So I love that. I pulled that out of the book, and we're always looking for perfection, but nobody's perfect.
Yeah, and the challenge is if you say this is the one way to do it, then everybody's going to expect you to do that one way all the time. And they're going to be, oh, well, it didn't work for you there, so therefore it's worthless. And so instead, like, get better. And when someone calls you on it and says, hey, you said to do this, but I see you're not doing it, you can say, look, I'm still learning on this journey. Here's why that skill didn't feel appropriate for me right here. Or maybe it should have felt appropriate and I should have been doing it.
Yeah, and I think it's how you've also organized the book a little bit, right? I mean, it starts with the personal, right? You can't if you can't lead yourself, how can you lead a team or an organization? So I think it's very interesting how you structure the book. You look at personal, then you look at the team, then you look at the organization. We're going to dig into this a little more. That was on purpose, right?
Yes, because the way that I think about leadership is there's lots of different styles of leadership, and this isn't about picking one or the other. But at the end of the day, leadership is about how you interact with someone who's doing work. And the first someone you interact with is yourself. If you can't figure out how to make yourself better and lead yourself, then how are you going to lead someone else? It's not even about being better. But if I want to teach you how to give someone a performance review, then I need to learn how to do a performance review first. And so every skill begins with you, especially because your affect, the way that you interact with the world, is such a big part of leadership. And that's what changes as you lead yourself.
Yeah, that's great,
Yeah,
Andy.
that's part of the
I'm
challenge,
glad you
though,
brought
right?
that out because in one of the sections you talk about attitude and attitude is totally under your control. And
Yep.
you come out and you say the world is great, but the world also sucks at the same time. And you have to be able to deal with that and understand that it can be this blessing and a curse that happens all the time. And you have to be able to adjust for that and always bring that A game attitude to the table, because life can be outstanding and life can suck. And we have to be able to deal with those ebbs and flows.
Yeah, and attitude is contagious.
That's right.
That personal aspect though is hard for a lot of people though, right? Because it takes an amount of self-awareness that I think tend to be lacking in quite a few people, right? To self-assess. They can assess others, but that self-assessment and having the personal awareness to figure out how you need to change your own personal attitude and approach is really important.
Yeah, absolutely right. Being able to self-reflect is going to be critical on your journey. But a lot of these skills don't really require you to think really hard about that reflection. You don't have to have this deep, detailed understanding of yourself to say, hey, I want to practice kindness, right? You don't have to know if you're good or bad at it, if you do it, 0 or 20% of the time, to say, I'm going to do it more. And as you do it more, then you begin to self-reflect. And that's going to be critical on your journey, is to understand, why do people do things? You sometimes have to ask why you're doing the same thing.
Absolutely. So Andy, as we think about the structure of the book, 54 chapters, right?
Yep.
But short chapters, right? You tried to make this really digestible. I think the chapter is literally a tweet, right?
Yeah, every chapter is on average 762 words. The chapter summary is the title of the chapter, and it is written as a tweet. So you can just look through the table of contents, and there are 54 lessons encoded as tweets right there.
All right, so let's dig into this. We're going to play roulette.
Okay.
We're going to go through 3 sections of the book. We're going to pull a number at random, and we're going to cover the lesson. Like, what's that lesson? So I'm going to go first. The first 18 chapters are personal. So I'm going to go with number 7.
Number 7. Oh, I love 7. And in fact, 7 actually talks to the self-reflection point that Ben just brought up. So chapter 7 is, don't borrow evil where it wasn't intended. And it's fundamental attribution error is a thing probably a lot of your listeners have run into at some point. This idea that when someone does a thing, you assume they did it for a purpose. And if it was a bad thing, therefore their purpose was evil. And so what you've done is you sort of borrowed evil. You've said, look, there is this thing that's happened and it was evil. Take, going for a car ride and somebody cuts you off and you get really cranky. I'm a Boston driver. There are times I'm like, dang it, they cut in at the last minute. They jumped ahead of me. And mostly I get cranky at myself for leaving them a space. But in that moment where you go to blame them, you borrow that evil, you're actually making the world a little bit worse. You're making your day worse. And what I found, it becomes this reflection moment, is to say, well, do I ever do that to someone? Right? Because if I say, oh, wait, I cut people off all the time. Like, I'm a Boston driver. I do it all the time. There's no malice. Well, first of all, it lets me forgive them. But it also now lets me say, hey, wait a second. If I got grumpy when someone did this to me and they didn't have any intent, well, when I'm not having the intent, I might be creating these problems in the world. So it's sort of this dual lesson. You can take it either way. One is, don't just assume that people were hostile or negative or ill-meaning. I often bring this actually into conversations about inclusions. When people like to talk about micro-inclusions, it's my favorite word is, small things to include people. We often talk about microaggressions, sort of this, small things that people do to cut you. I actually hate that word because in my opinion, there's either not micro or it's not an aggression. Right? If you say it's a microaggression, you're sort of borrowing evil. You're saying, oh, I felt othered in that moment. I felt excluded, and I'm going to assume that this person was a bad person. Rather than saying, no, they just weren't paying attention. maybe that's discourteous, but it wasn't actively harmful. It's an opportunity for us to grow together.
So as part of that lesson, then do you sit back and go, you don't make an assumption that just because something was done potentially maliciously, it wasn't with malicious intent, and therefore you approach it more from a positive perspective to learn whether it was malicious or not?
Right. You could approach it from a positive, but I'm actually a big fan of approaching it neutral. right? You don't have to decide between assume ill intent or assume good intent, right? And there are people who say, don't assume good intent when somebody's harming you. And I'm actually fine with that, but it's don't assume ill intent either. So walk into it, fact finding, being willing to learn. For instance, there's a bunch of foods I can't eat. And if somebody provides food and I can't eat it, I don't assume that they wanted to poison me. I might say, I wonder how we got that wrong. Did I know there was a meal and I forgot to volunteer my dietary constraints? Should I teach them as a planner that that's on them and they should have reached out to me? But at the same time, if I show up and then I assume that bad things are going to happen, I'm going to create a scene. Like I'm going to walk in, I'm going to create a lot of negative value in the room because I'm angry, which is the right reaction. When somebody actively harms you, it's fine to be angry and say, hey, you need to cut this out. But when somebody's passively harming you, that anger itself might create more harm than if you just approached it from a neutral perspective and said, hey, this isn't okay what happened. How do we make it better in the future?
Right. And then on the flip side,
I think that's
go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say, I think that's great, and I like how that applies to not just a work environment, but it's throughout everything you're doing in life, right? I mean, bringing kind of that neutral aspect to the relationship, especially as conversation and interaction has gone down this more quick path, right? It's not in person, it's not on the phone, it's you write an email, now it's just a quick SMS or a tweet, and the assumption, I mean, you're kind of bringing your energy into it versus really trying to figure out what is the person, what is the intent, what is the effort that person's or that team is trying to bring into it. And I find that often in teams, it almost separates teams, right? It creates this us versus them, where if you can actually try to get to what's actually going on, it's more inclusive and it brings people together versus bringing them apart. So I love that one.
Thanks.
And I just one quick last point on that one before we go to the next one, which is the reverse of that, right? Because you talked about this being kind of two-way. The second assumption is that you can almost say approach things without malintent to make the world a better place, which was kind of an interesting kind of takeaway on the reverse side of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you can approach the world and not be angry at people, gift them kindness, count your blessings. There's a bunch of other lessons around that. Like you can improve the world, but it's just this lesson is don't assume the other person is approaching it with malicious intent just because you were harmed.
Right. Awesome. All right. So let's go to the second set of chapters in the book are around team leadership.
Yep.
Those are chapters 19 to 39. Ben, pick a number between 19 and 39.
32 black.
32. Oh, Devin McCourty's number. I'm a big fan of that one. So 32 is actually, if you've ever done incident response, you'll love this one. This is when mistakes happen, don't waste energy blaming people. Invest energy in building better systems. And this one was really drawn from doing a lot of incident management and fixing things that went wrong. There's always a human trigger. Just to be clear, like complex systems, almost always you can say at the end, human error. But human error is a symptom of a system in need of redesign. It's one of my favorite quotes from Professor Nancy Levison, who's one of the smartest people in complex system safety. And the key here from a management perspective is when you find that human who triggered something, you should almost thank them and say, hey, we had this unsafe system and you're the one who found it. I think I recently saw some Reddit post about somebody who'd accidentally published the Kerberos credentials for their organization because they were in the tutorial document. And I'm thinking, this is not the new hire's responsibility to know that the example credentials were actually the administrator credentials. That's an unsafe system. And so when the person makes the mistake, whether it's the intern or whomever, you don't throw them under the bus and say, oh, they screwed up. You say, we need to build a better system. And what happens when you build that culture in your team is people will bring you errors. They'll say, hey, I made a mistake. I screwed this up. And you're like, okay, great. Thanks for bringing that up. Let us figure out what we can do, first of all, to clean it up, but then to prevent that from biting someone else in the future. That very, very rarely do people make mistakes because they were the problem. Usually they make mistakes because management or the organization was the problem.
Yeah, but commonly we go back to the individual, right? Like that's almost the first response that we have and the first reaction, and especially I've seen that management teams. So that's really good, and insightful. I like that one as well.
Yeah, and every
The-
time you throw somebody under the bus, then everybody else is like, "Ooh, I'm going to hide my failure next time."
Yep.
And you're
we're
not
gonna-
ultimately
that's
fixing
our
it, right? I mean, you're just masking it.
Yeah. Yep.
our first article in the leadership and communication segment next is one of those examples.
Exactly right. Throw someone under the bus.
Yeah, I was allowed to do that too.
Just saying. All right, Jason, it's your turn. You've read 2/3 of the book, but the third you have not read is the organizational section, which are their chapter 40 to 54. Pick a number between 40 and 54.
Number 45.
Number 45. Oh, if you don't pay attention, you'll miss the gorilla in the room. So this is a reference to the invisible gorilla. I'm going to give it away if somebody's managed to go this far in their life and not be exposed to the selective attention test, which is, and you can find lots of different versions of it, but the classic one by Christopher Chabris and Dan Simon is you have people who are going to pass a basketball back and forth. So there's 6 people, 3 in white shirts, 3 in black shirts. And you're told count the times the basketballs passed between the people wearing white shirts. And so there's 2 basketballs, one with the white shirts, one with the black shirts. It gets passed. And when you get to the end, you say, how many times was it passed? People are like 22. And then you say, how many people saw the gorilla? Because halfway through the video, a gorilla walks on stage, pounds their chest, walks out wearing a black gorilla suit. And about 50% of humans will not see the gorilla because they're so focused on counting and ignoring everything else. There's too much input coming into your brain all the time. So you ignore everything that is not what you're counting. And so the organizational lesson here is the things that we count are what we get, and the things that we don't count, we don't get. So when you're metricing your organization, and I use that intentionally in the verb form, you basically, like we all know, whatever you're doing, you're going to get more of. But imagine that you say, you're the leader of an organization. You say, look, wellness is important to me. Everybody should make sure they're taking appropriate time off, whatever that looks like. You get up at your all hands and you say that. Then you tell all of your managers, here's the key deliverables for the year. And nowhere on that is employee wellness, but a whole bunch of projects are there. And halfway through the year, when 7 new projects come on, you don't drop 7 projects off the list to match them. And so by the end of the year, like when someone says, hey, I need to take some time off, their manager is like, we don't have spare capacity for you to take time off. I need you in the office. We need to finish this sprint. We need to do whatever's going on. And if you at the top of the organization are not paying attention to that interaction, then you're going to miss that problem, right? And the gorilla in the room is your team, your whole organization is going to say, you're a hypocrite. You get up on stage, you say wellness matters, and then it really doesn't. You've built an organization that could care less about my wellness. And so you have to pay attention to it.
Right. And what I love about the book is that you call out places that you should be paying attention to that you normally wouldn't. So, for example, find your blind spots by hearing unbelievable things. That's another one of those places where, you really have to be looking, really have to be paying attention, and know where you have your strengths and where you don't, right? And allow people to bring productive conversation to the table. So knowing your blind spots, knowing where the gorilla in the room is, and really paying attention. I love it.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to Ben's earlier point of, you need to have self-reflection. And so there's a number of skills around self-reflection. And this one's an organizational self-reflection to say, what are the things that matter to you and how are you actually inspecting those rather than inspecting something else? Like I was a fan of saying, hey, everybody in my team by halfway through the year should have taken at least 1/3 of their available vacation time and should have a plan for at least another third already scheduled. And if we're not doing that, then we have a problem. Like, I don't want to keep people under the maximum. I want to keep them above the minimum.
Yeah. And it goes back to goal and objective alignment, right? I mean, if you're going to state that as a goal for the organization and none of your measurable objectives tie back to that goal, we have a gap. And trust me, I see this all the time. I see it in our own industry, Andy, right?
Yep.
We say we want to do this, but then we're measuring things that don't actually allow us to meet those goals.
And why is that, Matt? Because it's hard to do, right? I mean, Saying it is one thing. Actually executing is another thing.
It's absolutely hard to write down measurable goals, to actually find the ones that are real. And I like separating goals from values. Like, I like to say, look, I've got a value around employee wellness. That's always going to be a value wherever I am. And that means that you, as somebody who's on my team, should always feel like you can walk up and say, hey, Andy, you don't have a goal around employee wellness. Why is that? How are you measuring it or making sure that this is still happening? Or you've made a decision and it competes with your claim about employee wellness. What's going on? Why is this in tension? And so you have to make sure that you're creating that space for yourself to be challenged by yourself, by your metrics, and by your team.
And Andy, that's the next chapter that I have to get to. Values are the trail markers. That's where I left off.
Okay, that's one of my favorite ones. So I love chapters 40 and 41, which is the start of organizational leadership, which is on vision and values. And I'm actually right now doing some vision and values consulting with an organization. It's one of my favorite things to do, which is, I think most people get these wrong because they write these values that just feel good. Let's say, oh, integrity. Integrity is one of the worst values out there, unless you're Wells Fargo, because you didn't have integrity for a while. So you need to put it in there. Values are things that should challenge you, that you should say, these are the places that I don't want to make a mistake, but I'm likely to. And so if you're driven by the customer, you don't need to put customer, is the first in our values, but you might need to put employee wellness as a value, or you might need to put, sustainable software development, because otherwise you're always chasing the next feature and you're not resolving your technical debt.
Yeah, interesting way to think about it, Andy. Obviously, Jason started at the beginning of the book and has worked his way through 2/3 of the chapter. Is that how people should read the book, or do you have different guidance for them?
So people should read it however it comes out to them. For some people, it's start at the beginning and just work your way straight through. I have others who are like, every week they pick up the book, they flip through the table of contents, and they say, hey, what resonates with me here? I put out a newsletter about once a week, and I generally have, there's a chapter that's very obviously being highlighted. Sometimes I'll call it out. Sometimes you sort of have to read between the lines to figure out what the chapter is. And so I have friends who wait for that newsletter to come out, and then they go look and they find the chapter to sort of self-study a little more deeply because they want to engage sort of one chapter a week. So you can read it in whatever order works for you. If you've got a challenge right now, then go dig in on those chapters that will support you, and then come back and look at all of them. But if you don't have a plan, you're like, what's the easiest thing? Start from the beginning, because that's the reason I wrote them in that order is because they do build on each other.
Right. Where should people go to get the book, Andy?
So you can pretty much get the book anywhere you want. If you want a link to it for any of your various places, I've got a page at csoandy.com/book, but you can buy it in most physical bookstores, buy it online. It's available on audiobook. I read for it, or it's also available as an ebook. And I hear that sometime soon it will be coming out in Chinese, but that might be 12 to 18 months away.
Awesome. Andy, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thanks for having me.
And with that, we're going to take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles this week.